Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the first inaugural event jointly between the Open University and BCS Elite, or what I should say is formerly BCS Elite. Welcome to the absolute first event for the BCS Elite team under its new banner name of the BCS IT Leaders Forum. I hope you enjoy the evening. The first thing I guess that I'll go through is who actually is the BCS IT Leaders Forum. So we are a group of people, for those of you that are members, a group of people that are particularly interested in leadership within the technology function. We're open to anybody who is a leader or an aspiring leader in that function. And we hope to provide a good ground for people to have open and frank discussions without being necessarily marketed to or sold to by others, and to have conversations that nominally will be Chatham House rules, where we can actually help each other and solve problems together. I think when it comes to solving problems together, that's probably a good segue into an introduction to what tonight is all about, because tonight is all about the strange times that we're living in. And I think there are definite drivers for where we are and what we're doing at the moment, and clearly coronavirus, COVID-19, has been a massive change to the way we as businesses work and what we do. I can certainly say I'm an IT director over at Royal Mail, and I can absolutely say that the business that we are running at the moment is very, very much the same as what we've been running before. And you'll know that post keeps coming through your door, and parcels keeps being delivered, and actually more and more parcels keep being delivered. But take it from me, from some of the back office functions, we're doing it in a very different way than what we were doing before, and it is business as very unusual at the moment. I certainly haven't been in an office since February. I run quite a large team in the architecture function, and none of us have been in the office, and yet we've still managed to deliver change at speed. And keep kind of Royal Mail from a technology point of view ticking over, even though we're all probably sitting at home, the same as probably all of you are. So I think the context of tonight is to a certain extent to hear from three specific speakers around what business as unusual feels like for them. The format of the event will be each of the three speakers will have maybe 20 minutes or so to have a chat to us, and then open up for questions, individual questions for any of them at the end of their particular session. But also we want to have an opportunity at the very end of the meeting tonight to have a more general free-for-all Q&A. The way to submit a question, by the way, is currently up on your screens. If you want to submit a question, please use the Q&A button. If you have a look on the control panel that you should have in front of you, there is a speech bubble with a question mark in it over towards right of centre. If you click on that or hover over it, you'll see it's marked Q&A. And certainly if you click on there and pose a question, there'll be several of us in the background taking a look at questions being posed, and we will make sure that that question gets posed to the speaker. I'm certainly going to be grateful, I think, for the help and assistance of John Hall from the Open University during the processing of that. So you'll hear more from him in a while. Now, with that, and assuming that everybody can hear me, which is always something to ask when we're on these video calls, I am going to pass over to the first speaker, Jesmond. Jesmond has been active in technology for a long period of time. I'll let him do some more introductions of himself, but certainly with lots of experience in banking and more recently Malta Freeport. I hope that Jesmond will be able to talk to us around, from an overall ICT setup, what this business as unusual has really meant to him and his organisation. Jesmond, thank you for taking part tonight, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Phil, for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, which will be split in about 3 parts. The first part, I will explain who we are and what we do at Malta Freeport. And the other 2 parts will delve deeper into how this unusual situation is being tackled by us. But we will also see a particular case where an industry member of the shipping family was hit by a cyber attack earlier in 2017, and some figures of what happened and how it affected us and the industry as well. Next slide, please. So Malta Freeport is a major transshipment container terminal in the middle of the Mediterranean. It is among the largest terminals. We can say we are around the 2nd largest in the region, with an area of around 800 square meters of storage and container area, and around 2.5 kilometers of quay, berthing quay for our vessels. We are unique because we have also around 17 meters of draft of depth by the quay, where we can host and berth some of the largest vessels afloat. And this is quite unique because it allows us to participate in the transshipment business, where mainline vessels can call at our facility, and only very few facilities of this size are available. They can discharge a couple of thousands of containers, which will then be distributed via a hub network using smaller vessels. The facility is equipped with 21 quay cranes, which are the larger cranes operating on the vessels. There are 65 rubber-tired gantry cranes within the terminal, and around 170 trucks. So you can imagine hosting 6, 7, or 8 vessels simultaneously using that amount of equipment, what kind of logistic challenge it poses. Next slide, please. One of our major advantages is really our location, being right in the middle of the shipping routes, of the shipping lines. Can we see the next slide? In fact, you can appreciate that vessels coming from the Far East to North Europe or vice versa only need to have a diversion of around 6 nautical miles to call at our facility, where the other terminals will require substantial amount of time, that is practically lost time, to carry out this diversion and then join back the main trade line to continue the voyage. Next slide, please. We are proud to be in the forefront of technology. In fact, we use the world's most advanced terminal operating systems by an American company called Navis, which is the world leader in supplying such technology. Although today we do not perform automotive tasks, we are on the verge of moving on to semi-automation. So in the very, very near future, some projects which we're working upon will see some autonomous container moves being done via this semi-automation project that we are embarking upon. So it's a very exciting time for us as well. And the next slide, Jack, please. I will show you a small video to put what I've been saying more in perspective. And this video will show one of the largest vessels afloat, the CMA CGM Jean Maimon, which is a 400-foot vessel calling at Malta Freeport every 2 weeks. And this video will show the berthing procedure. This vessel is capable of carrying around 21,000 TEU of container space. A TEU is a measure of a 20-foot container equivalent. So you can imagine 23 containers across with double the amount of what you see below deck. So it's a huge piece of art. And we usually operate this vessel using 7 simultaneous cranes. So the discharge and load operations are actually carried out by 7 key cranes. But of course, there is a variety of other machinery, which I've mentioned before, trucks and rubber-tired gantries, which operate in symphony to perform an operation which usually is in the range of 4, 5, or even 6,000 moves. The key performance indicator for us is the number of moves we're able to perform per hour. So we reduce the port stay of the vessel as much as possible. An interesting fact about this vessel is also that it is actually carries the Maltese flag, so it's registered in Malta. And you can put what I've been saying into perspective to understand how 7 simultaneous cranes or 6 simultaneous cranes can operate the removal of boxes and so discharge and load of boxes to the terminal. And this, you will appreciate, entails a substantial amount of technological effort, especially at the pre-planning stage. So the best way to handle these thousands of moves is predetermined using some quasi-artificial intelligence systems to determine the best way, the best sequence of how to actually perform such an operation. And you will appreciate also that we are employing around 1,500 employees running over 3 shifts. So we can see the next slide, please. And you can appreciate with such a large number of employees, with the physical need to be in the terminal to carry out the operation, what the COVID-19 challenge meant to us. So with so many employees, hundreds of employees calling at our gates 3 times a day, meant that we had the issue of contacts. So we previously used biometric hand readers, and this was of course unacceptable in the COVID-19 situation. So we had only hours for us to react and change such systems to contactless systems. So we changed the system from a biometric hand reader to contactless card reading. So we're using RFID or barcode reading on the cards of each employee, but ensuring that the employee doesn't actually have physical contact with any equipment. Of course, another issue that we faced was the scarcity of personal equipment and sanitizing material, not only for us, but indeed for the whole island, being cut off as an island from the main industry. It posed a problem of availability of such equipment. Another huge issue was the open plan offices that we had, which were quite unsuitable. So we had to actually implement a large amount of changes to respect social distancing between employees. Next slide, please. And as everyone else, of course, we had to shift a number of our employees to start working remotely. Even though the infrastructure was fully available from a security point of view, from an IT point of view, but of course, not everyone was used. It's not a culture for our employees to actually work from home. So we had to adapt very, very quickly to the situation. It's an interesting point to mention that Malta Freeport handles around 3.3 million TEUs on a yearly basis. 96% of this is transshipment business, and only around 4% of what we handle is for the local import-export community. However, that 4% in turn is around 90% of all import-export for the islands. So you can understand the national importance that the terminal has as a status. So our response to these challenges was actually essential. It was very important on a national scale as well, not just as an ongoing business. Next slide, please. As we spoke earlier, we had to adapt to these challenges very, very quickly. I can assure you. We already mentioned how we changed from contact systems to contactless systems. We also had to organize the fumigation of equipment. You have to appreciate that each truck and each crane has a one user space cabin, which has to be fumigated now every shift. So that's 3 times a day for safety reasons. This for us is unprecedented, but also it's gets in the way of improving productivity levels. So the challenge is to try and retain the same productivity levels even with the new procedures. Can I see the next slide, please? Talking about remote working earlier, we have to also consider the security aspect. So it's not just simply enabling remote working or increasing the amount of people who work remotely, but to ensure that such work is carried out according to stringent security policies. The issue of training some users which weren't used to remote work, the issue of hardware. Again, being an island, it's not something, once the market is saturated, it's not easy to actually go out there and obtain hardware very quickly. And maybe I failed to mention that other actions we had to take was actually the thermal reading of temperatures at each entrance. And this is quite big, because we're talking about hundreds of employees coming in the gates 3 times a day, but also taking a thermal scan of each haulier, each truck driver that drives into the facility, and also going on board, sending a medical practitioner on board to actually check the crew, even though the crew are not allowed to land, but to make sure that each vessel that berths doesn't carry any risk in this respect. So during my experience, as Phil earlier said, I have experience working with HSBC in the IT sections. I worked for a startup company earlier, around 19 years ago, but in these 19 years, we never had such a challenge of this magnitude, where we had to react extremely quickly without stopping the operation, because as I mentioned before, stopping the operation would have meant an impact on the national industry or industries, and also an impact on the actual vessels which are on an international trade route, and that will impact their arrival in the next port and subsequent other ports. So the impact of delay in our port would be quite tremendous. Next slide. Now we will have a look at what happened in 2017 to Maersk. Maersk is the largest shipping line in the world. And I'm saying this because in our industry, in the shipping industry, we are not usually so much in the news. So what happens within this industry is usually not very much advertised. And I believe that this incident, which happened in 2017, had an extremely huge impact, even impacting us, I will explain later on, without the necessary maybe exposure that we expect from such incidents. In fact, as you can see on the slides, it was calculated about a $10 billion in damages that this incident, this cyber security incident had. And the effect, as you can see on this slide, affecting 17 terminals worldwide and practically a substantial amount of vessels around the world. So just to put you in the picture, Maersk, with 76 terminals around the world, lost all their IT infrastructure, their telephony infrastructure, their email infrastructure, their web services, and their web services, their main selling tool. So it is also directly related to their revenue. And they ended up without the capacity to actually pick up a phone and call someone. So from inside information that we have, the company actually had to go outside and buy laptops and phones from markets to try and get up to some kind of similarity to work. As a terminal, we were actually contacted by Maersk to ask our assistance to berth a vessel which they didn't even know exactly where it was. They knew it was somewhere in the Mediterranean, somewhere close to Malta, but they didn't even have the tools to actually pinpoint the proper location. So there are some tools, some free tools, but they do not give you the precise location. And we had to, of course, we cooperated. We were clients of theirs at that time, and we had to practically berth the vessel, go on board, try to interface with the vessel IT system to download and obtain information about the onboard situation with regard to containers, which containers should be discharged to Malta, what we could load, and similar information. We managed to do that. We managed to help a lot on this, but you can appreciate such an unusual situation where today, in a normal situation, we receive electronically vessel information a minimum of 24 hours before vessel arrival. So I think this is quite an unusual incident. Next slide, please. And you can see here some of the repercussions. So some of the terminals, especially some of the larger terminals in Rotterdam, were actually out of action for a number of weeks. And you can assess the impact on industry with the terminal unable to determine the location of any container. So the owners of the containers didn't even know where the container they were expecting is. So delays, huge delays in delivery of such containers had a huge impact on other industries, not just on the shipping industry. Of course, there were other industries which were hit. Some are known and some are unknown, who never actually went public, showing what happened to their business because of this cyber attack. And probably we will never know what happened. Can we have the next slide, please? This, of course, places a huge emphasis on how much we should give importance to cybersecurity. So it's very much an issue where we need to sell our demand for investing in cybersecurity, because once you have an incident affecting you in this way, the repercussions will be extremely huge, and it will more than justify your request for investment. So you are more than aware how important it is to educate the employees of the company, but also to ensure that cybersecurity is part of the C-level understanding. It is totally accepted by CEO and not considered as a cost, but considered as an essential service. This more or less terminates my presentation. So if you see the next slide, I will be happy to answer any questions which you might have.
Jesmond, that was amazing.
Thank you.
I have a question for you. You mentioned, this is from Anonymous and it came in at 5:15. You mentioned using AI for conducting operations. I think you were talking about how the cranes were automatically sent for loading and unloading. What is the knock-on effect if a single AI operation fails? And does it require human intervention?
Okay, very interesting. So let me explain how we use AI. So when we have a vessel, and this what we've seen in the video is a very good example, a 7 crane vessel with a 7,000 TEU operation working simultaneously. So 24 hours before the actual vessel arrives, we run this AI simulation, and the systems will actually propose to us the best way that the vessel can be worked, which equipment should be assigned, in which order, but also what kind of resources we need. how many trucks, how many cranes in the yard. And there's a lot. I like to say it's like a chess game. So there are a lot of combinations that that the system can check. So you can propose a higher number of trucks and cranes, which should make the operation faster, but it will also make the operation more costly. So one has to find the right balance, and the system will actually go through simulations to propose the best scenario. Of course, there is human intervention because there are some factors that only humans can actually assess, like, for example, weather. If there is adverse weather, even though the system might propose a large number of cranes, it might be wise to reduce the number of cranes. Or if you know that one of the cranes is more susceptible to fail, or the mean time between failure is lower than the others, you might need to reduce the number of cranes. So that is how we actually find the balance between AI and human intervention. Regarding the second part of the question, what is the knock-on effect of a single operation? In the execution phase, of course, we always have a risk of some kind of failure, be it an IT failure, an engineering failure, or any other type of issue that we can encounter. And of course, these instances do occur, but we have a lot of experience and a lot of procedures in place to actually mitigate such failures. For example, if the AI plan was to actually carry out the vessel with 7 cranes, and in the middle of the operation, one of the crane fails, then and especially if the crane is not one of the cranes on the side, but actually a crane in the middle, you have a really difficult situation. And there, it is only human intervention how to solve it. Usually, what you can do is either try to push the crane aside using other means, using special trucks, or if the crane is still mobile, using its own power. If the damage is particular, for example, that the crane cannot move on its own power, then you might even need to move the vessel itself and perform the operation on the vessel in 2 stages. So move the part of the vessel which should have been operated by the crane which has been in breakdown to be served by another crane. And these are situations which really need to have a real-time decision made. So we have people around the clock, both from an IT point of view, but also from an operational point of view, who are actually there to solve such problems. I hope I answered the question completely.
You answered that wonderfully, thank you. I mean, essentially you're doing the best that you can given the situation, or it sounds as though you're doing the best that you can given the situation. Thanks, Jesmond. I'm going to hand back to Phil Crew, who will introduce the next speaker.
Before I do that introduction, I've actually got a question for Jesmond, if that's okay. You mentioned during your talk that you needed to make sure that you weren't impacting other people by some of the actions you were taking. So, for example, if you delayed a ship in transit to Gibraltar, you couldn't do that because it impacts their timetable, and I fully get that. But I wonder how you were impacted by the fact that some of the operators maybe had their own problems with COVID, and that may have given delays with the shipping, or potentially some of the future ports might not be accepting the ships in to dock at the same timetable. Did you find you were impacted like that at all?
Initially, when COVID-19 surfaced, there was some panic in the industry because it was unknown of how we'll be tackling the situation. But quick decisions were made within the shipping industry in agreement with the terminals, and we took measures, some of which I've mentioned in the presentation, like not allowing any of the crew to actually disembark, expecting a certification from the vessel certifying that all the crew have not visited particular countries in the last 14 days and that none of the crew are showing any symptoms. Apart from that, we introduced a new procedure where we were sending up medical practitioners on board to actually physically check each member of the crew. And this gave us some peace of mind on whether we could be posing any risk or not with the vessel approaching. So I think that was tackled more or less by all the terminals. If something should happen, like we could always predict that a vessel could come alongside and provide us with a negative report about the health of their crew. And that would, of course, delay the vessels. So there are some business continuity measures which are prepared by the operations section within the organization, how to tackle such a situation. The worst case scenario would be to ask the vessel to bypass the island. And the effect of that will be tremendous, because both local industry and regional industries will be affected, because their goods will not be delivered, but they will remain on board. And that situation, fortunately, has not come to be. We did never need to do that. And otherwise, the second scenario would be to have a delay on the vessel due to COVID-19 issues. So either with the crew or otherwise. If there would be a delay, there is a deadline by which the vessel must sail anyway, because of the next port it needs to visit. So what we do is we respect that deadline, irrespective of whether the cargo has been loaded or discharged. Of course, we notify all stakeholders of the location of the cargo, but then either the cargo is discharged on the next port, and then it is transported back to other locations using feeder vessels. So there's a huge logistic networks which takes care of this container movement. Or otherwise, we actually wait unless the cargo has a deadline of arrival. We wait for the turnaround of the vessel. So usually it's Far East to North Europe, and coming back on the eastern bound leg, we then discharge the cargo at that stage.
Great, thank you, Jesmond. That's a good answer.
Phil, can I just say, please, that there is another question, but it's more applicable. It would be applicable to all the presentations, I think. So we'll leave that till the end.
Okay, that makes sense. So we'll make a note of that question and ask it at the end. Thank you, Jesmond, for that. Very good outline of what was going on, and thanks for the answers to the questions. Look forward to having you on the panel at the end. Next speaker I'll hand over to is Geoff Hudson-Searle. So Geoff is what can I think only be described as a serial business advisor. He's done quite a lot of things at sea level, and obviously been very successful at that, rated as one of the top 250 Harvard Business School authorities. Written books, and member of the Institute of Directors and the Business Institute of Management. I think too many things for me to outline and to do credit for. I'll let Geoff fill in some of that biography himself, but looking forward very much to hearing Geoff Hudson-Searle. Over to you, Geoff. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to be here, ladies and gentlemen. And can I ask Jack if you could just move me on to the next slide, please. Okay, so the original theme for today was really talking around the mindset of the boards, but also, more importantly, talking about some of the areas of business response planning and business continuity planning. Whilst I feel that that's important, as you can see on this slide, I have indicated purposeful leadership. So what I'd like to do with this presentation is talk a little bit about purpose within the organization. I'm going to go into that. I'm going to talk about risk management. I'm going to be talking about boards and response by boards to some of the challenges. And then hopefully that will lead us quite nicely into the Q&A. As my fellow indicated, I've got a broad set of skills, around 30 years of executive management. My NXD's covered regulation, technology and internet security. And my recent book, which is Purposeful Discussions, covers the fourth and fifth upcoming fifth industrial revolution. One quick exclaimer before I start. The opinions that you're going to hear today and what I'm about to say to you are the opinions of me, Geoff Hudson-Searle, and not necessarily the executive boards or advisory board roles or the companies that I represent, including my own. Okay, Jack, can we go on the slide, please? These are some of the books that I've associated and local press and national press that I've been in recently. Jack, if we could move swiftly to the next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so lots of people are using the term the new normal era. I think we live in incredibly interesting, unprecedented times, but I don't think we're new to these times. If we look at something like Spanish flu, which was a huge event where, you know, we lost 50 million people and there were 500 million people with symptoms, and we look at SARS and we look at the other events, we're certainly not new to major events or major catastrophic events, global events, of which all boards, management teams need to actually have planning for, particularly around things like crisis management. I use the word trust at this moment in time. Some of you on this webinar may be familiar with the work of Stephen R. Covey, who wrote The Trust of Speed. This is nothing new in business. But we are seeing a lot of it. But for me, you're in this period of there needs to be more openness, there needs to be more transparency, more about the relationship, more about the experience and purpose, which constitutes trust. I actually think we're in a very interesting era. I'd like to call it a listening era, an empathy era. I'd like to call it more than that. I'd like to say that unless we fully understand people, we are not going to be able to communicate effectively to the people around us. And in which case, how do we expect execution of any good strategy without that formula? So I think that's incredibly important right now. Excuse me. When I say we, IBEM, that's International Business and Executive Management, commissioned a trust report back in January of this year. Very interesting. It was commissioned to DataPad, went out to thousands of employees. But what was interesting was the findings that actually came back. What we came back with was a synopsis on the summary that showed that 69% of all people that entered into the survey did not trust their line manager and did not trust their CEO, which I don't think there's anything new there, which really brings me on to leadership, because leadership was fragmented before COVID. What were we really expecting to see through unprecedented times of the global economy and global business if we already had a fragmented set of leadership skills? So when we look at leadership, you may or may not recall the McKinsey report that took place last year, which was a global survey to 14,500 global leaders around the world, which at varying sizes of organization. But out of the 14,500 businesses that were actually interviewed, surprising enough, 84% came back to say we couldn't manage change, crisis, or continue current levels of growth within the economy, which is very scary, because that only means that 16% allegedly from this survey have actually got the skills. So no big surprises then in March when EY launched their global report on COVID planning and COVID readiness. that was alarming to me, in as much as it showed that 80% of all boards and businesses were not actually prepared for COVID. Scary. I mean, my business partner in the US, on March the 20th, when I spoke to him about business response planning, and from a chairman's point of view on a large US company that he's chairman, came back to say that we've approved the plan and we have executed. That is obviously in the small minority of the 20%. So I think trust and the problems, as I said earlier, are not new. We have been challenged, and COVID really has changed what I consider to be the experience of either being an employee, a customer, a citizen, or actually even a human being right now, because what we're seeing is dramatic effects on people and humans within the organization. So I studied for the last 12 weeks, I've studied greatly on this subject, and I don't know if any of you on the call that may be aware of Taihoro Kono's report of work on strategy and structure of Japanese and UK enterprises. But what he was really observing when he completed his white paper was how many companies actually look at long-term planning versus short-termism. And more importantly, how we go from design to execution and what the results were. He spent many years studying this and actually visiting companies, spending times with their management teams and looking at sort of the long-term value. Now, when I start to look at long-term value, I look at business plans that are 50, 100, 150 years. I look at the Vision Fund. I look at Son in his planning and the generations of planning that have been around some of the acquisitions that he has made. And it's not just about a culture or a tone, in fact, that we have at the top of the organization, which I think is clear. But irrespective of that, the main differences between Japanese companies versus UK companies was the fact that the UK planning system we emphasised, as opposed to in Japan, there is clear goals, which I emphasise, with clear definitions to execute. Now, on the board of directors, my biggest challenge when I challenge C-suite executives is not on the hypothesis of thinking, although I encourage thinking and I also encourage an ethos of thinking. I'm very much about execution, driving performance and driving success for the business. So I think this is something that we need to look at on not just a macro scale, but on a global scale about the reset. And this period has given a lot of companies to furlough. I had a piece, a PR piece put into the Sunday Times talking about business continuity, HR, and talking about furlough. Certainly some of the companies that I have spent time with and still spend time with, I'm very happy to say we didn't furlough one employee. But does that mean that we didn't look at the structure of our employees and looking at a new strategy with scenario planning, with reset, with looking at what people we really need within the organization to start driving those revenues forward? Of course we did. And the part of the scenario planning is very much on the very same thing as I've just described, which is execution. Because however many great ideas we may have, at the end of the day, the balance sheet is what we account for and the people driving that balance sheet, more importantly. I think this period is incredibly interesting in terms of organizational structure and processes. I think every company in the world is needing a clear vision to direct change. I mean, I'm talking about agile, but I'm also talking about flexibility. I'm talking about Darwinism. Yeah, it's not the strongest of species that survive, but certainly the one that's more adaptable to change. And I think company directors face more heightened pressure, but there's nothing new there. You know, if you're in a C-suite role or your executive board role, you know, you have a role and you're accountable, and you need to be spending more time in actually defined outcomes. You know, whether we're challenged with political, geopolitical, whether it's legal, whether it's economic, whether we're dealing with an acceleration in technology change, which Jesmond has talked about some of the technology moving into his area of operation, or whether it's standard things like corporate governance, regulation, compliance. Recently, you know, we've been in the press within the last week. You know, we've seen some of the disasters you know, that some companies are having to deal with, particularly around FCA and regulations and things like SMCR, and how boards and management need to be accountable for their actions. So I think I'm a great believer, and being an NXD for the last 10 years globally has given me a lot of scope. And some time ago, I wrote an article on about corporate governance, that this should not be stored in the C drive. This should be a living, breathing, philosophy, very much like purpose within the organization. It's not just about one person's ego and his or her position within an organization. It's about working with people to create that one overall goal. It's about working together on a journey to achieve with their health, with the softer sides of skills. And we've talked, some companies are talking about hiring CPOs, chief purpose officers within organizations, because purpose, as I said before, truly is about trust and encapsulating others and having those clear, defined vision, mission and value sets that we all adhere to with a purpose to achieve. As that certainly doesn't mean that you are either with IQ or with EI, or hopefully a balance of the two, but it does actually mean you've got to understand your people, you've got to listen to your people, you've got to have empathy for your people, and I think this is really important. Do boards need to step up? Absolutely. There is no question that the boards of companies need to be more accountable. We've got to walk away from certain areas such as the blame culture. We need more experts to actually provide the right level of data sets, analytics, detailed information from a risk perspective, and that needs to be more in real time as we start to shift. The paradigm shift is going to be super fast between the fourth industrial revolution and the fifth industrial revolution. I think COVID has accelerated our behavior by possibly up to 5 years in the last 90 days. So we've got to be better prepared. We've got to have better insights to information in order to make better decisions in terms of strategy. I think the world event that we're talking about needs to be planned for. Companies may not have been planned for COVID-19, but they should have been prepared for crisis management. So I think all of that is incredibly important. So some tips, I guess. Response planning. Incredibly important. I'm not talking about business continuity planning here. I'm talking about response planning to an event like COVID. I'm talking about, scenario plannings, operation modeling. I'm talking about being able to reset from growth with flexibility and being agile at the same time. I think it's important to have internal audits with a strategic plan which is aligned to the organization's overall strategic plan. I think we've got to look at the balance of risk and as well. And if we don't have those data sets, we don't have those analytics, how are we as professional executives going to be about being able to make a decision which is based on what are the risks if we don't actually apply, what are the risks if we do, and making joint decisions on how the company is going to survive and hopefully thrive. So it's really a difference between maintaining, sustaining and growth. But governance, risk, and more importantly, I think what we've come into very quickly with COVID is the virtual century. I think it has been about reinvention. It's certainly about corporate purpose. And I think from a final thought perspective, I would say responding strategically to the current economic event requires a much higher degree of creativity, as we've seen. And we've seen with the companies that have already accelerated with reinvention, with creativity and openness to these challenging assumptions, have been able to look beyond the obvious, addressing these issues, these threats, but more importantly, embracing these opportunities for growth and for future survival. And the next 10 years, I guarantee you, we've got a lot more coming towards us in terms of technological advancements, and people need to be reset with a different mindset, different set of thinking in order to take us to ultimately where we want to be. And whether that's a company point of view, exit strategy, whether it's an IPO, whether it's a sale, or whether it's just opening up into different and newer markets to actually drive company performance, all of this needs to be encapsulated, agreed upon, and various scenarios in order to address these issues. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Geoff. That was amazing. I've got a question for you. Some good questions coming in at the moment. This is John Hall with some questions for you. You've talked an awful lot about the importance of trust. And you've talked about other words like accountability of the board, the C-suite level. Which other ways do C-levels build the trust with their staff?
Trust for me, it's nothing new. I mean, it's a bit like strategy. Strategy hasn't really changed since the Roman days. Okay, it hasn't. In some respects, it's just got more complex. But the methodology of design around strategy hasn't changed. Just like trust. Trust is in everything we do. Trust is in relationship. It's about engaging others. So, in order to engage others, you've got to listen. You know, we've seen how the ego can destroy an organization. Micromanagement is actually a very good way of destroying an organization unless you're in a very high risk short-term project or short-term period. Okay, our employees need to be creative. They need to be around innovation. If our aim is to push innovation, trust is in everything we do. It's in the relationship. To have that relationship, you've got to be listening. You've got to have empathy. You've got to have understanding. And I question, actually, if you go back the last 5 years or even the 10 years we go back, how we were communicating to others. You know, we went from the fax machine to the text message to the collaboration tool to, we skipped email. We weren't necessarily interpreting, briefings or information correctly, swamped by lots of small messages, but actually a massive disconnect. So if anything, we have actually taken ourselves down a path where we've created mistrust. And it's taken an event like COVID to turn everything upside down on its head and start questioning some of the most basic things that we have available at our disposal, including working from home, where trust has had to come back to the forefront, to the foreplay. Without trust, You're not going to have relationships. You're certainly not going to survive through this period without trusting, third-party supply chains, basically trusting your peers, trusting, people within your organization, trusting your CEO and line manager to do the same. So unless we start adopting a different attitude, a different mindset, we're going to fail. I'm sorry, we're going to fail.
That's a lovely answer, very, very deep and searching. Perhaps difficult to take in the whole import of that. So do you have any examples of organizations, of people that are getting trust right? I'll ask this before handing back to Phil.
Yeah, there's plenty in my book if you care to read it. I've 32 chapters. I have written extensively on the subject of trust, and I have got, I've got plenty of examples. Believe it or not, I was involved in a project 10 years ago. Please don't, I'm not here to humour you on this, but it was the Bank of England, and I know what most people would say if you said, you've gone to the Bank of England to say, actually, I'm going to bring a sympathetic trust into your value sets, and I'm going to emotionally engage your people to a higher level of emotional intelligence, and I'm going to increase productivity, which in turn will increase the objectives. But we did it. Okay, we did it. Hewlett-Packard, I've got another example, taking a very similar methodology of thought process there and taking it to HP, and that also works, and we proved it. So that's 10 years ago. Yeah, that's not a year ago, that's 10 years ago, that's a decade ago. Some organizations that we took our hypothesis to said, I think you're too advanced for us at this point in time. But what they were failing was the Witherall Trust Report, which interviewed 169 banks, relationship banks, worldwide and internationally. Okay, all came back with the same thing. The customers do not trust the bank. The bank does not their staff, employees, do not trust their management to take them where they want to be. Their management does not share the same values that they do. Recently, I was on a US webinar talking about the millennial boom. Where you've got super good millennials, 35 to 45, driving C-suite roles, super smart, super intelligent, 100 tasks instead of 10. Not a great deal of focus, but I played with the analogy that if you were to take Gen Z, Gen Y together with the millennials, so that's why I talk about why I've just done a piece on why, an article on why there's a necessity to have a board to support millennials, to support entrepreneurialism, to support their programs and innovation. Because if you take everything that a millennial's got and everything that a board member should have, working together, you've probably got a really interesting formula through this period of, I don't want to call this period uncertainty. I look at Isaac Newton, who in 1665 and 1666 produced his best work for Cambridge in isolation. So you've got to look at, yes, we have been in isolation, but innovation has got the ability to thrive. But I go back to, you've got to embellish purpose, you've got to embellish trust, and you've got to embellish a different set of leadership driving these kind of initiatives.
Got it. I think Isaac Newton was our first alumnus from the Open University. So that's a good plug there. Thanks, Geoff. I'm going to hand you back to Phil.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Geoff. That was quite certainly very interesting, quite challenging. It's good to have some kind of forthright views, and I certainly look forward to having you on the panel at the end, where I suspect quite a few people will want to challenge on what good looks like, and in particular whether you've got any examples of what good looks like, because I think any of us that have lived through the current crisis or not crisis will say, what are we doing well, what are we doing badly, and who should we be aiming for? So thank you, Geoff. That was really good. next speaker and final speaker for tonight before we move into a more open Q&A is Chris Youles. Chris, I want to personally thank because as the Open University CIO, he's obviously helped us and guided us through getting this particular joint event off the ground and running. And certainly I look forward to hearing what he has to say. He's had a past of quite a lot of major technology transformational change, and in particular business performance improvement, data analytics, learning systems and so on. And obviously as CIO of the Open University, they've got very significant programs of work going on at the moment, especially around things like AI and machine learning, and focused on kind of student experience. So I look very much forward to hearing what Chris has to say. And thank you, Chris. Over to you.
Thank you, Phil. Thanks for that introduction. Good evening, everybody, and thanks to Jesmond and Geoff for some sort of fairly fascinating talks on two sort of quite different areas, but with some common themes coming through. So first of all, just a quick introduction to myself and to my role at the Open University. If we could just move on one slide, please, Jack. So, and I'll also apologise. I don't think my slides are quite as jazzy, certainly as Jesmond's. So a little bit more sort of downbeat, and I promise not to bore you with PowerPoint. So within my portfolio at the Open University, I have IT, information security, a data function, some strategic technology change, and digital. So a fairly broad portfolio linked really through technology. It was interesting as I listened to Phil's intro. He talked about things looking and feeling the same but being very different behind the scenes, and that struck a real chord with me as I imagine our students with their own significant challenges through this period, hopefully witnessing in most cases the service from the Open University looking and feeling pretty much like business as usual, but the reality of that behind the scenes being very different. And across my portfolio, across all of these areas, we've absolutely witnessed that. Can we move on, please, Jack? So just to reflect, and again, Geoff's presentation resonated with me completely, and there are a couple of things that I wrote down from Geoff's presentation as we went through this period following lockdown in March of this year. I mean, effectively, the Open University moved from being a largely campus-based university based predominantly in Milton Keynes, but also offices in Manchester and Nottingham and across the other three nations of the UK. And we moved from this very campus-centric organisation with, I think it would be fair to say, some quite traditional ways of working, some perhaps question around whether we as a collective trusted our staff, there's that word trusted our staff to work from home. Surely if they work from home, they'll be sitting in the garden, you know, in the sun, you know, drinking whatever it is that they drink, and they won't be doing any work. Surely that was, you know, the mindset that I think we approached this, and I think many organisations went in a degree of trepidation. We you know, worried about this idea of what technology would they use, how would they collaborate, how would we make them effective, how would we make sure that productivity didn't take a dive, and you know, there's as I say, a huge amount of synergy there with some of the points that Geoff was raising around that, you know, reinvention, creativity, trust. So we did face challenges. We faced some significant challenges. We had a desktop dependency, you know, at a very practical level. Most of the people on our campus were quite simply on desktop computers, and you know, they weren't going to rip those out and wander off home. So we needed to get a heck of a lot of laptops for many of our staff in fairly short order. We, you know, remote access, and again, Geoff talked about business continuity versus kind of response planning. I think our business continuity measures are very good and have been very good. I would question, as I think Geoff was highlighting, our response planning measures and things like, of course, we know we've got remote access. Has the practicality of that been tested? Do people know how to use it, etc.? Information security was a risk. Of course, you know, it was evident even in that period in March that information security related issues would inevitably be on the rise. And then, you know, again, some of the practicalities, people didn't have home offices. They were going to go and sit in the kitchen or in the downstairs loo or wherever and try and, you know, function as best as they could. The reality is we moved within the space of a week. We did something that we couldn't have conceived, if I'm brutally honest, you know, 2 weeks prior to that. If I'd said to the Open University, folks, in a week's time, we're going to be working from home and actually we're going to be quite effective, I don't think anybody would have taken me seriously. Let's move on, please. Please, Jack. So it was interesting to witness how our staff responded. There was that fear of change. There was people, you know, worried that they were going to be sitting in the kitchen with, you know, 5 kids running around, you know, screaming at the top of their voices, and whether they'd be able to do their job. They were worried that the tech wouldn't work, that the, you know, bandwidth wouldn't allow for, you know, 67 kids to be on, you know, whatever, Fortnite or FIFA or whatever, and people trying to run video conferencing. They didn't know how the tools work necessarily. And then that changed, and it changed actually quite quickly, and it changed into people getting familiar with it, and people even then moving to a position where they thought, hang on a minute, I quite like the chat down the right hand side, and people who were in Scotland thinking, well, hang on a minute, I'm on a more equal playing field here, because rather than there being a few shouty folk in a meeting room in Milton Keynes and I have to do my best on a Skype call to get some sort of recognition, no, we're all on Skype. And you know, the manner in which those meetings were and have been conducted gave everybody a little bit more of an equal footing, and the chat allowed more interesting debate and discussion to go on. Next slide, please, Jack. It meant a lot of changes for our students as well, and as I say, just going back to Phil's comment, well, most of that, you know, hopefully will have been business as usual, and their distance learning will not have changed dramatically. There have, of course, been changes to the way that we provide service to our students, not just across the UK, but around the globe. So, of course, you know, some of those face-to-face examination, face-to-face tuition, and some of our examinations were cancelled. We had to go very quickly to remotely support not just staff from Milton Keynes, but across all those nations. And again, whilst most of that infrastructure was in place, it certainly hadn't been tested on the scale and the pace that happened a number of weeks ago. Our student support centre, you know, the university thrives, and much of its success comes from this fantastic student support that we have. But that student support centre is you know, very traditionally based in an open plan office where people can lean over their shoulder, you know, if they've got a query that they don't know, and get the best possible answers and the best possible support for our students. Suddenly that support was being provided by people who were sitting in their kitchen, who were working from home, who couldn't just lean over their shoulder and say, hang on a minute, I've got a tricky one here, how do I solve this? And again, that took a little bit of time, but the reality is it wasn't as scary as we thought, and in fact that service to students has been maintained throughout. Technology, of course, you know, we'd already introduced chatbots. We'd done it cautiously, you know, we'd introduced chatbots, and there was some concerns prior to COVID-19. Is it the right thing to do? Students want to talk to people. They want to pick up the phone and talk to people. The reality is they don't. Some students do, but some students don't want to talk to others. You know, in fact, quite the opposite. They want to interact via social media, via instant message, via chatbot, via email. They don't want to pick up the phone. And so, surprisingly, some of that technology that we've you know, sort of piloted and trialed a little cautiously suddenly became a bit of a lifeline for many of our students. The telephony decreased, and you know, we're not unique in that. That's reflected across many different market sectors. Social media interaction increased again, as you would expect. Next slide, please, Jack. As if kind of the challenges of COVID and just moving a kind of a business as usual, if such a thing exists, you know, from being office and campus based to working from home wasn't difficult enough. We happen to be in the middle of a major systems replacement at the moment. which had started in earnest about 18 months ago. So we're replacing our core HR and finance system with a new ERP, SAP ERP platform, and we're also replacing our student administration systems. So March the 23rd, the week following that, you know, those teams picked up all their kit and wandered off home, and we were nervous. I was nervous. Back to that, you know, trust, that question of trust. And again, another line from Geoff about accelerating our behaviour and the way that we work. And we raised, you know, a number of risks at the time to say COVID-19 will derail this programme, and it's a multi-million-pound programme, you know, whole raft of people involved in it. And for me at that time, I thought, I don't know how we're going to do this. You know, we've got user acceptance testing due to start in June, which it has just started. How will we do UAT remotely? You know, how's that going to be effective? How are these people who are very familiar with working face to face in an office environment cope when they're working from home with so many other challenges, of which work might be quite low down their priority list if they've got other challenges associated with COVID-19? Next slide, please, Jack. And the reality is, and there's some of the key messages here, the staff, our staff, have been fantastic. They have far exceeded any expectations that I certainly had, you know, personally. They have responded in a way, and I think it's to perhaps some of Geoff's messages. They have responded in a way that has been quite incredible. There are a couple of questions in the chat about providing examples of where this has been done well. The Open University is a fantastic example of where it has been done well, and I'm extremely proud to you know, make that statement. People have been flexible. Our staff have been flexible. If they've had kids to look after at lunchtime, they've chosen to work in the evening. They might have missed a Friday because, you know, all manner of things were going on. Maybe they were, you know, looking after elderly relatives or loved ones, and they've chosen to work on a Saturday to make it up because they want to do it. Collaboration has increased, and there are exceptions. There are those informal chats where you meet for a coffee and they're invaluable, and clearly that they have gone. But our collaboration has become a bit more focused. There's a danger, of course, that we go too far and we spend, you know, far too long talking to our laptops and not enough time, you know, sort of interacting as human beings. But the reality is, it has improved, it has increased. And again, quite incredibly, our productivity in many areas has increased. One of the phrases that's been used to me a number of times is that people's kindness increased, and whereas perhaps in a more traditional conventional office environment it would be easy to become impatient or perhaps short on the appropriate etiquette, we've seen that reduce, and we've seen people, I say, perhaps interact in a kinder and more accommodating fashion. Again, one of Geoff's comments was around leadership, purposeful leadership, and I think the university has displayed some fabulous leadership throughout this period. And I think that the staff have trusted. In fact, the results from a recent staff survey have indicated that staff have and are trusting those senior managers within the university to be making the right decisions. We've adopted new ways of working that we haven't previously considered. We've been forced to, and rather than moaning about it and dragging our heels, we've embraced it, and that ultimately has led to a real increase and improvement in the way that we provide our service to students. Being very parochial, very close to home, it's been a good time for the Open University. You know, we do distance learning. One doesn't have to look too far around the higher ed sector at the moment to see that the words digital, distance and learning feature quite prevalently across all those areas. We've been in a very privileged position. We've been doing it for a few years. We're actually pretty good at it. And it's been great that central government has come to the OU for our help and guidance and support in some of those initiatives that are being driven to help the UK economy get back on its feet. Next slide, please, Jack. So you know, what's next? You know, lots of positivity despite such a, you know, difficult, traumatic in many cases set of circumstances over the last number of months. You know, what's going to happen? You know, at some point, goodness knows when, you know, the COVID-19 restrictions are ultimately lifted. Do we all, you know, hop back in our cars, get out to our offices and just, you know, pick up where we left off? And I think the answer is quite a resounding no. It's clear that staff do want, some of them do want to go back to the office. They don't necessarily want to go back 5 days a week. They want to go back and perhaps blend with that working from home. They've enjoyed the trust that has been, you know, quite frankly, we the university in our case has been forced to give to our staff, and they've thrived on it and really risen to that challenge. And the university has realised that, you know, and we're far from alone in that. You know, many organisations have witnessed this working from home, this change, and in many cases improvement in our ways of working. Of course, we've got to keep our eye on things like, you know, mental health and that balance between where does working from home become working all hours from home and you know, never quite getting away from the laptop. So we've got to make sure that balance is right. But one can see that reduced travel with benefits that may have to the climate, and that blended approach being a real fixture going forward. This digital student interaction, this acceleration of adoption of technology, I think has been dramatic, and one can only see that people are reassured, people are more competent and confident in the use of the technology that they might have shied away from because they've had to use it. And in turn, I hope we will maintain that level of engagement and collaboration driven by the technology, and then supplemented by that face-to-face, that informal time that technology simply can't replace. That's it from me. They were kind of the key messages that I wanted to share. Thank you for choosing to join us this evening, and I hope you found the three sessions useful. I know, John, I think you want to move on to a wider Q&A session, but I'm very happy to take any specifics on the few issues I've just talked about.
I've got a couple of specific questions, one of which is general as well. But one for you, how many of the changes that you talked about working do you plan to keep? And the more difficult part of the question is why or why not?
So I think, John, as I've said, I think many of those changes will remain. I think that as lockdown restrictions are gradually lifted, we will look at how they can be supplemented with, as I say, whether it's a more blended approach where we get the benefits of both home working and campus based. And there are some areas that, in fact, I was having a conversation with somebody today, there are some areas and some roles that rely on that informal conversation. That I've just caught somebody in the queue in the coffee bar or whatever, and it was a really key 5 minutes. So we've got to make sure that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater here, and that we hopefully achieve a harmonious balance that can bring benefits that stretch, as I say, perhaps just beyond our day-to-day jobs, and as I say, maybe benefit climate and other areas as well.
Thanks, Chris. Great answer. So we're looking for your questions. We have loads of questions to ask the panel. What I'm going to do first is hand back to Phil for any closing comments from him. Then he'll hand back to me, and we'll take it towards the questions that we've had submitted. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Chris. That was really good. Before we go into the panel session, I think what I'd like to say is just how much one or two things that you just said resonated with kind of me and my experience around Royal Mail. And in particular, I think the thing you said about the lone Scotsman suddenly feeling just as empowered as a group of people in Milton Keynes. We've got some people based in Chesterfield and others in London And there's always been that, there's a meeting goes on in a London meeting room and a couple of people join over Skype from Chesterfield, and they find it very difficult to make their voices heard. And the absolutely unanimous verdict we've reached at the end of this is we need to change the way that we do virtual meetings, because if everyone is virtual, it's a great leveler. And actually making that a level playing field for everybody. I think some of the feedback we've had on that, some of the comments, it's really changed what was not a huge divide, but there was definitely a different approach between the two offices. And I think if there's any one thing that's changed it, I think it's this: we're all virtual now and everybody's got an equal voice. So I just wanted to share that with you. That really resonated with what you said there, Chris. So thank you for that. Thank you to all of our presenters. I thought that was a great three-part presentation on three different aspects of what we've been looking at. I think now what we want to do is open it up for some general Q&A. So effectively anybody can ask any question that they want, either individuals or the panel to answer. There's some questions already lined up. I know that are there because those questions were asked previously, and we think it would be probably a great panel question. And the moderator during this panel session will be John. So thank you, John. I'll hand back over to you.
Thanks, Phil. Okay, so I'm going to start you off. So we got Geoff, Jesmond, and Chris on the panel, and I'm going to start you off with a really easy question. What percentage of IT staff do you have working remotely at the moment? And how have you had to change your management processes? So there's a really easy question. There's a percentage for the first question, and then you can go on as much length as you want about how you've changed your management processes. Let's start with Jesmond.
Okay, thank you. It is an easy question, and the answer is also easy. Virtually, we have no IT staff working remotely right now. In reality, we have only one person, but is working because of personal family health issues, nothing to do with this COVID-19 situation. Since about 2 weeks ago, we recalled everyone who was working remotely. The reasons are that our business is very much hands-on. And except for maybe software developers, there is no huge benefit in leaving staff working at home. We don't have huge distances here. I commute, and I'm one living the most far away from the office, and I commute for 12 kilometers. So you can imagine how it's not a big deal to come to work. But we need to be here because, for example, our support staff need to use handheld radios. We need to be here. It's a very physical job. We need to go on site to support the fleet, for example. For this, so that's the first question. Even in operations, so not only in IT, the same applies. For example, our control room employees cannot work from home. Practically, doesn't make sense. It's not feasible at all. Turning to the second part of the question, we did our best to actually not change our management processes. So we adapted ourselves to the situation to keep the same, more or less, the same processes applicable.
That's great. Thanks, Jesmond. So over to you, Geoff. It might be more on the organisations that you advise rather than your own organisation.
I'm happy to take it from a technology point of view. I've got something quite positive to share to the group. So a company that I spend time with, I'm an executive director on the board. We have operations in Canada, US, UK, Europe, and we have operations in LATAM as well. Obviously, we have working from home. During that process, we commissioned a employee survey, satisfaction survey on, responses on leadership, management, operations, and also whether or not they wanted to return to work. Surprisingly enough, we got a 42% response saying they don't want to go back to the nice offices that we have around the globe. So I would say, and our view is we are now upskilling and investing in systems and IT to take us to the next level, and we are adopting the way that we view the business and its operations.
And the management structure, the management processes? Management
And processes, we've been very effective in leadership through the period. I'm proud to say we also are strengthening the leadership team. But to be honest with you, again, a new possible C-suite hire that we are discussing right now will be virtual.
Thanks, Geoff. Chris, same easy question for you.
Yeah, I think it is, John. So we moved 100% of our staff to home working back when the lockdown came into force in March, with the exception of literally a handful of folk who have been on campus in Milton Keynes building laptops and the such like. We have the team have worked remotely. Much of that is software development. We already have a fairly significant offshore software development house as well, and so we're fairly familiar with not necessarily all sitting in the same place. We will start to transition some staff back onto site over the next few weeks in support of other units that are going to start returning in dribs and drabs to support student operations. From a management structure point of view, we've stayed largely as is, and it has been highly effective. And again, the IT director made a comment to me the other day that she said we've gone from being this kind of back office service that everybody just expects to work and nobody really ever says anything particularly complimentary about because it's never fast enough, quick enough, expensive enough, to actually being perhaps a bit more appreciated for the massive amount of hard work that goes into keeping services running, and the management structure supporting that has been highly effective and has received sort of widespread praise from around the university and indeed students for the support that's been offered.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so now you've had the easy question, we can go into the hard questions. Alistair Lomax has asked a fantastic question, which I'd just like to broaden slightly. What Alistair asks is, what would you say about coalitions driving innovation, such as the Northern Powerhouse and the Oxford-Cambridge Arc? But what I would like you to think about, what does government funding need to change to provide for future resilience in this area? And what do they need to motivate? What behaviours do they need to motivate and what to discourage in organisations? So all the way from the Northern Powerhouse to the Oxford-Cambridge Arc through to government, what are they supposed to be motivating and what are they supposed to be discouraging now? Who wants to start?
I don't mind starting.
Thanks, Geoff. Go ahead.
I don't mind starting. So if we go back, can I go back in history a little bit? So it's always been known that there needs to be a bigger intervention of government to, let's just say, corporate business and SME business. This period's been really interesting. So I see that actually innovation in lockdown should be thriving. And when I look at my 5 tips, or my 5 key tips for this period, and when I mean this period, the last 90 days, I talk trust as number 1. I talk about how we're addressing the online world. Your health and well-being is everything. It is an innovation isolation, and we need to have purposeful authority. So money is not always the answer, because the paradigm between activity and productivity. We need to have a direction which, if the UK is going to fly the flag and do what it's good at, which is innovation and exporting innovation to the continents, then we've got to have a different mindset. We've got to have a different approach But as I said, I don't see this as fundamentally just another way of just getting government to write a check. It's not about that. You've got to have that purpose. You've got to have that leadership, and you've got to have the skills and competencies that drive innovation.
Fantastic. Thanks, Geoff. So, Chris, Jesmond, focused government action on motivating good stuff and discouraging bad stuff.
So I think John, just picking up on a few points. We have seen across many different market sectors innovation forced. You know, and I was talking to a colleague who's CIO at a law firm. And they were talking about digital signatures on legal documents. And there had been so much debate leading up to COVID-19 about the validity and legality of digital signatures, and invariably the signing of legal documents was accompanied by, you know, a few glasses of champagne and a group of 10 or 15 people getting together in an office, having finally, after 6 weeks, you know, managed to get the right signatures on the right piece of paper. And he said, you know, overnight, digital signatures became accepted, and whilst, you know, the champagne has perhaps remained in the fridge, and there's been some disappointment that those 15 people haven't been able to gather, he said suddenly 6 weeks was cut off. That particular, you know, process that has bugged the you know, the legal profession for some considerable time. And I think there are examples like that we can learn from. You know, the question was back to those coalitions driving innovation. We should look beyond our own market sectors, looking across other market sectors at examples of perhaps whether it's COVID-19 forced, perhaps not, but those innovations that are helping to drive and improve the way that we provide service, the way that we interact, the way that we, you know, our lives operate, and again, you know, that health and well-being is a real key component of that, and making sure that we're doing things for the right reasons. And I would agree with Geoff absolutely that money isn't always the answer. In fact, you know, often you can find that there's money being pumped into innovation, but it's being done blindly, or it's being done in the wrong areas or for the wrong reasons. And we really need to make sure that we are focusing on the right areas of innovation, and that we form those coalitions with those organisations, you know, whether it be the Oxcam ARC, which obviously very close to home for us in Milton Keynes, or whether it's further afield. I think it's really key, and clearly the Open University already spends a considerable amount of time interfacing with those types of organisations, and we need to do more of it.
Thanks, Chris. Jesmond, your funding regime may be a little different.
Exactly. In fact, I'd like to look at this from a global perspective. The shipping industry, we're talking about players from around the world, players from China, from Japan, from Asia, from Europe, from across the world. So the innovation changes are really being driven by the market and driven by how more efficient one can be. And what we've seen in the last years is, whereas 10 years ago we had 20, 30 shipping lines available in the market, today we have 5, 6 major shipping lines which have actually combined and taken over the small ones, creating massive, few in number but massive shipping lines. So I think this is, from our perspective, this is how the answer to this question is.
Is that desirable or undesirable?
It's difficult to say from an efficiency point of view, and one of our shareholders is actually a shipping line, so it's in our interest to have an efficient shipping line. So from an efficient point of view, it is desirable, because the utilization of each vessel has drastically increased. Just imagine 2 Far East to North Europe vessels traveling at 50% capacity, changed instead to only 1 vessel with 100% capacity. So you can imagine the vast amount, the dramatic amount of improvement in efficiency that brings about. So by and large, I would say it is desirable. It is the way.
If I bring you back to something Geoff said earlier about Darwinism and the ability to adapt.
Yeah.
Are large organizations more able to adapt or less able, or do you need the diversity of approaches that many organizations would give to have that future?
I would say that it's much easier for a large organization to adapt because you have the resources.
Right.
But then maybe part of the answer should be they are also much more vulnerable to fail if not done properly.
Very good. And the innovation must have some place in there as well.
Yes. In fact, and coming now back to the local industry, so the terminal operator, innovation, and in our case, technology, is probably the only tool that we can use to edge ourselves above the competition. So yes, innovation is the catalyst for us to remain a leader. Without innovation, we will simply fade away, because as soon as a customer contract starts to finish, if you are not innovating and you're not offering attractive services, then you're bound to be forgotten, and other terminals in the region are used instead of you. If you just take the Mediterranean, for example, we can look at Greece, Italy, Spain, even southern France, and in the future, Northern Africa will come into play as well as major competition. And without innovation, you will really be sidelined and practically stop.
Thanks. Geoff, do you want to come back on that innovation issue?
In what respect?
If you think, you talked about Darwinism earlier and innovation keeping people alive or keeping organizations alive as they progress into the future. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about whether large or small innovation is good.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree with Jesmond. I think it's good to challenge. Sorry, Jesmond.
This is what we want.
You know, I'd like to challenge. I think that the difference with the larger organizations is they have the financial strength. They're sizable. They have the resources. They have, as I said before, but to get innovation approved through the hierarchical is can be a long drawn out process. With successful SMEs, Darwinism, I think, is easier because it's not just about flexibility. It's about adaptability. It's being able to capitalize on opportunities, and their failures can be not having enough investment ready at the right time to make the move that is required to drive growth. But I would say that smaller businesses, I think, are easier, and it's just purely because of the approval processes and the layers of sort of hierarchical that you've got to go through to get things approved. In some respects, it's not necessarily the most innovative that works for larger companies. It's the one that works and can be shown to actually be applied quickly. And I think with smaller companies, there's a lot more creativity around innovation. We've seen that time and time again in the fintech space, and we're seeing that in other industries and markets too. We're seeing that now with retail, where certain retailers have been hit badly, but we've seen how COVID has embraced opportunities to change and drive. And this is a very interesting period for that part of innovation. So sorry, Jesmond, but wanted to.
No. I think there's a really interesting metaphor here between big ships and small ships. Big ships find it difficult to turn, small ships don't. Now, Chris, coming back to you, the Open University is one of the largest universities in the world. That puts us very much as a big ship. Do we get it right, and the balance between innovation and sheer bloody mindedness?
I think it's a little bit of a blend, John, somewhere along the line. Do we get it right? Clearly, we don't always get it right. Clearly, and I think on the whole we get a lot of things right. We can learn from some of those more nimble players in the market. We can learn from those universities who are looking at a blended approach, even for the start of the new academic year in September, and we can learn from them, and so we can't become blasé about it. We can't become complacent and think that because a traditional conventional university has decided to offer blended learning, what could they possibly teach us? And I think that the university, the OU, has worked hard to make sure that it continues to learn. Ventures such as Future Learn and the recent buy-in from Seek in that space is clear evidence of that trajectory of continuous innovation, looking at the market. What does the market want? This year, for the first time, we're going to be part of UCAS clearing for full-time school leavers who might be nervous about going to a conventional university or have some other reason for not wanting to do that, even more so in the current climate. We're looking at micro credentials as this sort of insatiable desire, particularly for the younger generation, everything has to be now, and immediately consumable. And what do you mean? I've got to study for 6 years. I want to study for 6 minutes and end up with the same outcome. And clearly things like micro credentials, etc., are part of that innovation, part of that way of making learning accessible, enjoyable for a different generation, for many different generations coming through. So yeah, we're adapting and moving with the times, and I think it's been interesting to see the impact, again, just bringing it back to the impact of the last 3-4 months or so. And how the OU, it demonstrated that the OU can be innovative, can move quickly, and I suspect that some people may have questioned that prior to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so a question from Anonymous, who may be an owner of a small business, I don't know, but we'll get that from the question. How often should continuity plans be tested? There are potentially many different situations to plan for. Testing and reflecting on the execution of these plans could become a costly and time-intensive task. Is this feasible for a small business? I'll start with you, Geoff, who perhaps has most experience.
Exactly. Okay, so from a business continuity plan point of view, irrespective of whether you're a small business or not, you should be aligned to the risk management, risk register or risk assessment within your business. They should be continuous in terms of continuous improvement. If you want to improve, you've got to constantly look at your processes. You've got to constantly refine the BCP. It should be a living, breathing document within your organization. If you're a small company that has the fortuitous opportunity around operations to have a CISO as well, particularly in the cyber era that we're involved in. You may have seen the Swiss RE article in the Financial Times this week, which said if businesses do not have a business resiliency report, we may turn them down for insurance. This is how serious it's getting. We spoke earlier, Jack and the team, talking about cybersecurity risk, talking about ransomware, talking about DDoS. Everyone remembers I Love You. The list just goes on. If we are not looking at business resiliency within business continuity planning and risk management as a living, breathing document within our organizations, we do not give our organizations justice to survive. It's as simple as that, in my opinion. And as I said, these should be worked on a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly basis. And if you're a small business that still has a board of directors, this is data sets and data analytics and information that should be reviewed by the board on a regular basis. Is there
any benefit of doing that regularly for a small company? Is there any additional value to going through those processes regularly?
100%. Here's where it goes wrong. You wake up one morning, you've suddenly got no servers, no IT, no systems, and you suddenly recognise the fact that you haven't actually taken correct. Your choice.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we've got the 5th industrial revolution coming towards us, and if you are not taking cyber essentials, cyber security, business planning, business continuity planning, risk management, risk governance seriously, I'm afraid to say you shouldn't be in business.
Yeah. So Jesmond, how do you have advice for small businesses?
I couldn't say it much better than Geoff. My way of looking at this would be that the answer will be given when one assesses what will happen if such a risk actually surfaces. So what happens if you actually lose systems or lose the potential to continue your business? And that will help you answer yourself, how often should the continuity plans be tested, which is as often as possible. You must become an expert so that when, and if it can happen, it will happen. When it happens, you already are capable of actually reacting quickly.
Nice. And Chris, I'm going to take a slightly different attack with you, which is many of our students are small business owners. What does the Open University do for our students that prepares them for building, for resilience within their business?
Okay, thanks, John. I've just prepared my answer to the previous question,
yeah,
John. So thanks for that last minute change. I also agree with Geoff. I'm going to get that bit in 100%.
That's good. Geoff, you've been very useful. Thank you.
So what are we doing for our students? So one of the things that we are building on. So we recently appointed a CISO. I think the university absolutely gets the significance of cybersecurity. Our business continuity has recently shifted from flood and planes landing on the campus and that very traditional approach to the reality is, folks, as Geoff just said, that you're going to wake up one morning and you haven't got any computing power left. We, the Open University, are committed to becoming, one of the most secure universities that you can study with. It's something that we want to promote with our students. The generations that are coming through expect security as a matter of course, not as a bolt-on extra. And we are spending considerable amount of time helping students, particularly in the current climate, through webinars, through information, etc., to help them become more familiar with what's involved in today's business continuity planning. And whilst power cuts and floods should feature, they probably sit somewhere behind a DDoS attack or a ransomware attack or a phishing attack or whatever it happens to be. Yeah. And we have a responsibility, we have a duty to make sure that our students understand, some of them really, quite rightly, this isn't their business. Their business is something completely different, and they are looking for us to not only look after their own data and to keep it secure, but also to help them in their studies and with the technology. And I think that will be an area that the Open University pushes quite hard over the coming few years.
That's great, thank you. We're running out of time. We've got about not more than 12 minutes left, unfortunately, and there's some really good questions. The next one is, Geoff talked about COVID has accelerated 5 years into 90 days, 5 years of change into 90 days. 5 years, a 5 years plan is a good horizon for a business. But if that now turns into a 90-day plan, what does that do for your 5-year planning?
Well, I would like to find a business that has got a strategy for 5 years. Sorry, that's rhetorical. So you're quite correct. What I mentioned earlier was that we have accelerated 5 years in the last 90 days from an action point of behavior. I also said earlier, which I think is incredibly important, is that we cannot confuse activity with productivity. Productivity creates defined outcomes. Activity, from a point of view of being busy doing what exactly? Strategically, we had no choice. as a board, within the boards of directors, C-suite and directors, to actually start looking at a series of scenario plans, and you should have been doing that a very long time ago. I sat through Black Friday, dot-com boom, SARS, Ebola, double dip, 2008, 2009, and where we were working, we had business continuity plans, we had scenario plans, we had crisis management plans, and we had preventional strategies. So, from a point of view in terms of planning, you've got to look at disaster. You've got to look at budget, you've got to look at optimistic, and you've got to look at possibly a thrival plan. This is something that has to be dealt with. If you do not have the skills internally, you bring the skills in. Either you create an advisory board, or you create people like me that sit on executive boards to actually support the business and helping the business through these kind of events. So I think it's incredibly important that entrepreneurs move away from the micromanagement and I know everything, let's see what happens, to strategic planning and execution, and looking to build value and valuation within their businesses over a period of time. And that, 3-year, 5-year, 10-year, as I said earlier in my speech, the Japanese look at 50, 100 and 150 plans. They don't come off that focus. It might have an adaptability, have to adapt and change based on circumstances and economic impact, but they stay on plan. And I think that we've got to start addressing strategic planning and strategy to execution within our own respective businesses, irrespective whether you're small, medium or large.
Thanks, Geoff. Chris, 5-year plans or 90-day plans?
Yeah, again, I'm with Geoff. I'm not sure about 5-year plans. I think the key for me here around the productivity improvements are, the last 3 or 4 months have produced some real nuggets of gold, and perhaps it's helped us to evidence the busy that is actually not really achieving a great deal. I think that we need to look back carefully, and we all do across different market sectors, at what the last few months has meant, about how things have changed and where things have improved. And there are, as I say, some real nuggets over the last few months. There are clearly some areas that are less good, and we should pick up on those key areas, those key productivity improvement areas, and look as to how we can develop them further. Why did it improve productivity? How did we manage to adopt it at such pace, when our hands were forced? And that they're the learnings from me that we've got to take forward and apply as we move forward into this kind of brave new world post COVID. That's the real key for me, because there are some productivity improvements to be had. We've already done that. We've done it in a way that we probably couldn't conceived in many cases, back in January or February.
And I've got about 3 minutes. So Jesmond, I'm going to come to you for the last thing. You must change on a penny anyway with the new technologies that are coming in. So you must feel this pressure all the time. After COVID, will you just relax back into your previous mindset, or?
No, I don't think so. And trying to get into perspective, 5-year plans, definitely not in our case, but 3-year plans, certainly.
Yeah.
In our industry, we need to predict what's going to happen and start reacting now, because infrastructure or changes, like, for example, adding additional key cranes, will certainly take 12 to 18 months to affect. Just look, we saw in the presentation a 21,000 TEU vessel, one of the largest vessels afloat. Mm-hmm. If we go back 8 years, what was a 10,000 TEU vessel, so half the size, was considered the largest vessel afloat. So the immense amount of growth in terms of vessel size, for example, unless terminals had the vision to predict in 3 or 4 year plans to prepare for such a change, they wouldn't have survived. And certainly there wouldn't have been the terminals which survived and the others which didn't. So I say in our industry, it's a bit different. The outcome is a bit different.
Okay, I'm gonna. That's been fantastic. Thank you guys for your input. Really interesting. I've made some notes, if you don't mind. So we're gonna make something of this discussion afterwards, I hope. And with that, thank you, Geoff. Thank you, Jesmond. Thank you, Chris. I'll hand you back to Phil, who now has a short example from the Royal Mail Group. Thanks,
Thank
Chris.
you, John, and thank you very much for kind of hosting and moderating that session, and thank you, Jesmond, Geoff, and Chris. I think that was a great session. I think the example I'd give from a Royal Mail perspective of what it's meant, what COVID has meant from a speed of change point of view. It interests me. People talk about 3 and 5 year plans. Royal Mail, always being different, had a 4-year plan. And that's pretty typical. It always has to be different. But the 4-year plan was to take account of the fact that letters were declining, parcels were increasing. We'd seen letters decline of around 5 to 7% year on year, and parcels increase at around 10% year on year. And that had generally been happening for the last 5 years or so. In 2 weeks, when coronavirus hit, in 2 weeks there was a 33% fall in letter volume and an over doubling of parcel volume, and that got us to the point that we were expecting to be in 2024-25. The number of parcels we're now moving, we always joke that we're a pretty standard business until about 4 weeks before Christmas, and then over that 4-week Christmas period we work exclusively for Santa Claus, and we just shift 2.5 times as many parcels as we do at any other time in the year. We're now during, when are we, July, which is generally a quiet period, we're moving more volume of parcels than we've done in any Christmas that's gone. And the current prediction is we'll not get the letters back, and we don't think the parcels will fall off dramatically. So literally that 90-day change, or in our case an almost 15-day change, moved us forward about 4 years. And that's the challenge that Royal Mail faces. With that, and with a couple of minutes to go, and I'd like to finish just a little bit early to make sure that nobody that's enjoyed this evening will overrun. I'd like to thank everybody that's joined us. I hope you've got something from it, and I hope you take something away and have a think about it. And if there's anything else that you think that I suspect, certainly I can speak for the BCS IT Leaders Forum, if there's anything that you think we can help you with, please reach out, get in touch. We're more than happy to kind of engage in a conversation and to see where that leads. And if that leads to you maybe taking more part in that IT Leaders Forum, then that'd be great. We'd love to have you aboard. I want to thank particularly the people at the Open University that helped and support us run this event. I think it's been a really, really good joint event, and I look forward to running the same ones again in the future. I'd like to really thank the 3 speakers who I think have really shown us 3 different aspects of what business as unusual has meant. And I'd also like to thank, there's a few people working hard in the background that's been collating all of the questions, that's been ensuring the Teams call went well. And I'd really like to give a personal thanks to those as well. Just like any IT department, they're unsung heroes. Tonight, nothing went wrong, and for that, I give them a complete round of applause. Thank you to everybody for joining us. Sorry?
Nothing went wrong yet.
Gone wrong yet. Thank you, John. With that, I wish everybody not only a nice rest of the evening, but general wish to stay safe. And I look forward to actually meeting you again on a virtual meeting, or at some future point in person at a BCS Elite or an Open University event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're unlived.
We're unlived. Very good.
Yeah. Well done.